Much for
This
okay.
meeting
All right. Everyone, if you're just joining us, thank you so much for taking some time out of your morning or your evening or your afternoon for this special Ask the Judge series with Cyril Wong. I just wanted to let you guys know that this is being recorded. So, there's just Cyril and I on screen for now. But just note that you can always come back to this if you need to watch it again, and whatever, we will open this later to Q&A. So whatever questions you ask, all of it will be recorded. So I'm just going to go ahead and officially start our series. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much to Cyril. We are so honored that you have also taken the time out of your day to be asked this series of questions and also to read your poetry. Before we begin, I wanted to quickly introduce myself. My name is Kim. I am the managing editor of Gaudy Boy, which is a New York City-based indie literary press that publishes poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction by writers of Asian heritage residing anywhere in the world. I'll be moderating this talk today. So, bear with me, even as you are here to listen to the star of the show. Cyril obviously needs no introduction. He's the reason why you are here. But, just in case, Cyril Wong is a poet, fictionist, and critic. His most recent poetry collection is Infinity Diary, out in May 2020, so keep an eye out for that, as well as the novel This Side of Heaven, also out this year. Cyril is the recipient of the 2005 National Arts Council's Young Artist Award, as well as 2 Singapore Literature Prizes in 2006 and 2016. And of course, he is the judge of this year's Gaudy Boy Poetry Book Prize, and we're so happy to have him. So Cyril, just so that everyone know, we will start with a poem for you. It's a quick poem, and then I will give you some questions that I thought of. We will have a friendly discussion, and then after that, we'll open the floor to questions from the public. So everyone who has joined us, please be prepared to ask Cyril all the questions you've always wanted to. This is your chance. Quickly, you can write your questions in the chat box here in the Zoom link, or another thing that you can do is you can raise your hand, and I think all of you should see a little raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen. Raise your hand, and I will allow you to talk, but we will leave that to the end of the meeting, so I'll let you know when to begin raising your hand. Okay, and finally, before we let Cyril go into his reading, I wanted to let all of you know about the 3rd Gaudy Boy Poetry Book Prize, which is now open for your entries. Basically, we are accepting an unpublished manuscript of original Anglophone poetry by an author of Asian heritage residing anywhere in the world. The winner will receive book publication as well as an advance of $1,000 US. And we distribute our books in North America, but we have also recently expanded our distribution to Singapore and Southeast Asia. Past winners of the prize was Lawrence Lacambra Ypil and Jenifer Park, as well as Paula Mendoza. So, you'll be in great company. And the deadline of the submission is May 15th. Guidelines for entry, you can go to our website, you can go into our Facebook and our website, singaporeunbound.org/opportunities for more details. And I think I've said enough. I will leave it to Cyril to start your reading.
Oh, okay. So I guess I was asked to recite one poem.
Yeah.
I guess I'll read a poem about a one-night stand because
Great.
that's the kind of poem I like to read. This one is called Hotel. And as I mentioned, it's written right after a one-night stand. It's called Hotel. In the cupboard, bare hangers are skeletons for future selves. A complimentary bathrobe waits like a new and better, even purer skin. Bathroom slippers become footwear for shuffling up an airy flight of stairs out of this life. Open the fridge, lean past the overpriced chocolates and the smugly settled soft drinks, and tune in to voices from the god realms where beings reminisce not unfondly about past desires and mistaken attachments. On the bed, Bodies stay unentwined in rest because love belongs to a different room in a faraway country. Beneath us, cowering children press their ears to the floor, absorbing the footfalls of fathers retreating, heads lowered in shame or shaking with disgust. In reality, the aircon sighs as discreetly as possible. Behind translucent curtains, night slowly lifts. Nobody expects the morning to be spectacular. In any case, my eyes are reluctant to close, still hungry for all that is new, while another stranger beside me sleeps and sleeps. So that's my poem.
Thank you so much. Just that talk about, sleeping beside strangers, I think, even though, I'm sure many people have one night stands, but it's still very evocative.
Sleeping beside strangers is like my metaphor for reading also. I mean, I've learned so much from books, but I also learned so much from sex, basically. It's like, you learn so much about other people's narratives just by literally sleeping beside them. Yeah.
That's so poignant. Yeah. I mean, in that sense, everything in life is just like kind of a metaphor for reading, right? Which I guess is what makes us poets with poetic sensibilities.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much again. I guess I will start with, a question for you, Cyril, and I'm going to ask a few before I turn it over to the public.
Yeah.
So my first question, you are the judge of our third Gaudy Boy Poetry Book Prize, and as the third judge, you're following in the footsteps of previous judges, Vijay Seshadri, the American poet who was born in India and who came to the US at the age of 5, and of course Wong May, a poet of various transnational identities. China, where she was born, Singapore, where she lived during her youth, she studied in America, and now she lives in Ireland. So of course, both of these judges brought, their own sensibilities and histories to the judging. So in that vein, I wanted to ask you what you hope to see in the manuscripts that come in, and how you think your appreciation and your evaluation of these manuscripts might be influenced by your own sensibility and your own history.
I think I find that there is, at least in Singapore, there is definitely a very marked difference between the way poets judge other poets as opposed to, say, academics or literary scholars. I think with poets, with poetry collections, I think all of us tend to look for something that is extremely surprising, that surprises us as poets, that gives us the same kind of pleasure that we get from reading poetry. I think there's no better way of being read for a poet than to be read by another poet. I always write for poets. There's no point in doing anything else. So I think that's one of the main things that would be a similarity that we all have, is that we would be very open to being surprised by what we read. And usually the most surprising collection would be the one that really strikes us as, oh, this is my favorite, because we have read so many poetry collections over the years. Yeah.
So when you say, being surprised by, someone else's poetry, have you noticed any patterns or trends in the poetry that surprises you? Are they very different? Do they have, similarities?
Actually, for me, I find that as a reader, I all my life as a writer, as a reader, and as an academic, I've always found myself being surprised by the fact that I read all kinds of poetry. It's a very simple thing to say. Actually, it's a very inane thing to say, but I actually enjoy a very, very wide range. I sleep with all kinds of poetry, from the most seemingly straightforward, straight-talking kind of like spoken word to the in America, I usually quote this example of like from Marie Howe to Susan Howe. That range of like very lyrical to very abstract and very experimental, even though I really don't like the term experimental. Poetry is just poetry. Poetry just must have something to say, must say it well, must say it coherently, and it doesn't matter what the style is. Sometimes the message is more obvious, sometimes the message of the book is more embedded, and sometimes the book itself is just an experience, experience of words, of images, of ideas, and that itself is a message. The medium is a message in that sense. So I read all kinds of poetry, and that's something that struck me as not as commonplace as you would think. There are, I know many poets, especially in Asia, that are very, very limited, not limited, but restricted by what they read. They only like certain kinds of certain genres of poetry or certain kinds of of prose and academic writing. So it's like, why? I mean, there's so much writing out there. Why not appreciate the writing on its own terms? So I don't know what I will bring in this sense, because I'm a poet that will enjoy every single collection on its own terms, which now that I'm saying it makes the job a lot harder, because I'll be like, yeah, but I love this too, you know what I mean? It's like it's no, there's no what's the word? There's no unshakable standard of like what is the best kind of poetry or the best kind of collection. I love all kinds of voices. Even the most conversational voices to me really appeal to me. So it might just depend on my mood on that day or something like that when I decide which is my favorite.
Right. And you just mentioning that reminds me honestly of what we faced with the very first Gaudy Boy Poetry Book Prize when we were going to pick a winner. And I don't know if you're familiar with what happened there, but it was actually really exciting. We were planning to have one winner, and Wong May came back, with just a split decision. I love both of these poems, both of these collections so much, and it was just so amazing how different they were. One of them was,
I hope not to do that. I really
I also, that's definitely not in our plan, but it was.
Because I also come from an administrative background, so I know the pain of like, oh, why did this judge do this to us? So I totally get that. But it has to be very clearly justified why I picked, this book. I mean, there's this quotation by Margaret Atwood that has always stayed with me for a long time, even when I first started writing and entering the literature scene. I think she said in one interview, after having won so many prizes, she said, literary prizes are a crapshoot. So that's like, okay, this coming from you is pretty hilarious. But it's really, really true. It's like my favorite book of the day, it depends on the time of the day and depends on what I've experienced, right? And it's especially so for poetry rather than prose, I feel. It's a lot easier for me to say, judge a piece of prose than a piece of poetry. It's a very peculiar kind of situation. Yeah.
It's just so personal.
Yeah, it's very personal to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
At the same time, I try to balance it out by the fact that I read all kinds of things. So I'm not biased because I myself am a more inclined towards lyric and confessional kind of poetry. But I love all kinds of poetry. So I hope that will balance it out.
Yeah. And what you also mentioned previously about seeing that that I guess pattern maybe of some poets in Asia who perhaps tend to kind of limit themselves to certain genres. I think it's a very interesting thing, and I'd love to dive into it if you'd like. Right, one of my questions anyway for you was kind of what trends do you see in the poets who identify as Asian coming from Pan-Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, versus, perhaps these Asian identifying poets from America, Europe, Australia, what you consider the Western world versus the East, do you see any kind of pattern?
I mean, it gets, there's a lot of, I mean, if you were just to be academic about it, there are, in terms of broad strokes, I do find that there is this increasing demarcation between more straight talking kind of poets, and I mean, there's a real distance, really a huge gulf opening up between the kind of more lyric, more personal kind of voice and the very experimental voice. The experimental voice is becoming extremely experimental, and the cliques that are forming even within the country, like the Philippines. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of different poets in the Philippines, and there are cliques that really detest each other. It's so political. It's like, why? It's just you just write a different poetry. Why do you have to create this kind of weird political tension about it?
Wow.
There are poets for poets' sake, and then there are poets that do the cafes and the bars and stuff like that. And the demarcation is just growing in a very implicit way. And now there's all this. Of course, there's there are all the political themes as well. There's all this talk about, I mean, I've always joked that the image of the marginal is very in now. So the feng shui is right for marginalized voices to kind of make it. And everyone should make it during this period, because we don't know when this period of openness will last, because nothing ever lasts. This is a trend where all these marginal voices are winning prizes and coming out, and their voices are being heard. They're getting a huge audiences. Strike it where it's hot. So that's the kind of one trend I find very fascinating. I think this extends into Australia, Canada, New Zealand as well. You see all of these non-white, non-binary kind of poets that are just creating really, really amazing poetry collections and getting a lot of publicity for it. Yeah,
you definitely see it in the US too. And in the US, I don't know what the conversation is like in Asia, but in the US, there is that certain weight about that, especially when you consider the fact that while marginalized voices are very, quote unquote trendy now, I hate to put that horrible reductive word on it, but for lack of a better word, they are trendy now. But also that's because it's happening while things like American Dirt is being published, and gaining all this attention and getting a huge advance. Basically, if you don't know the story about American Dirt, it's a white woman who writes about the Mexican immigration border crisis and was then called out by a lot of wonderful Mexican immigrant writers. So yeah, definitely a very interesting time, and that's why I guess maybe Gaudy Boy's mission, is also very interesting to me, and I don't know what you think about this, because in countries like, let's say, America, where the press is based, Asian writers kind of form this marginalized group. However, in Asia, and then again, there's so many different communities in Asia, right? You have in Singapore, for example, Chinese, Malay, Indian, Eurasian, that reductive, again, for generalized grouping, of races that the government has imposed on us. But then someone who is Chinese, who is writing, he is or she is the majority in Singapore, and he's not the same kind of marginalized group in America. So, how is there do you have any thoughts on that? How do you figure that out?
I think this kind of, I mean, I call it tribalism. I call it a kind of tribalism that will always happen. It just takes a different form. Even though I'm talking about how marginalized voices seem to be having their time in the sun right now, but that kind of reductiveness still happens. I remember last year at the Writers' Fest, there is, everything is a response to racism that's happened before, the kind of prejudice that's happened before. But sometimes the problem very quickly becomes very human. Prejudice becomes met with prejudice. And the kind of reductiveness is a result of that kind of response. It's like everyone suddenly is on a kind of revenge plot, right? It's like suddenly I'm not just black, non-binary, I'm very black, I'm very non-binary. It's like, and then the things that said during the Writers' Festival last year, when I think I was on a panel with Dana Smith, and Dana Smith basically said out loud in front of the whole room, she's like, they, the poet is the pronoun is they, and they basically said, oh God, I really hate white people. And I was like, oh, okay, I don't know how to follow up with that, with a statement after that. It's like, but that's the problem, that is actually very human. So even though it might seem that the literary scene everywhere can seem to be a bit more inclusive and diverse, but that kind of tribalism never goes away. It just takes on a different color, takes on a different shape. And it's for me, as for Gaudy Boy, maybe it's an opportunity to find that kind of bridge and to not reduce it to mere tribalisms, if you know what I mean. It can start a conversation in which, like, you know, you cast the spotlight on poets that are not obviously, you know, playing that kind of like a new marginal voice card, you know, but, you know, poets that are interesting in that sense, or maybe not so interesting. Even a poet who's not that interesting, it is still interesting now, because the poet maybe might not fit into the usual boxes of being queer or non-white or non-majority race or stuff like that, but the writing is still very experimental. It is all over the place, and like, how do you pigeonhole a voice like that? And the main problem, I think, with a lot of trends and a lot of literary scenes is this whole need to pigeonhole, to put people under certain categories. So it's interesting if publishers like Gaudy Boy or like different kinds of small presses, they make it as an opportunity to erase those kind of categories or to problematize them by introducing poets. They go like, now how do you fit this poet in? That conversation is very interesting. So if publishers can further that kind of conversation, that will be more intriguing than just, you know, when different writers of different scenes put on a political stance and defend it with their lives, you know.
Yeah, that's a tall order. Thank you for challenging us. Something to look forward to. I would love to continue talking to you about that topic, but I will have to open the floor now to the public, since it's 9:23 p.m. Or a.m. So to everyone who's attending, if you have a question for Cyril, what you can do is you can do one or two things. You can either put your message or your question for Cyril, sort of put it in the chat box here so everyone can see it, and I can, you know, express it to Cyril on your behalf. Or something else you can do is you can raise your hand. There's a little option at the screen below that will allow you to raise your hand. When I see it, I will allow you to talk, and then you can, through audio, ask Cyril your question.
There was an earlier question here in the chat that I
saw that. Yeah.
Can you tell us your favorite poets and what are you reading now? Gosh, it's hard to get any books now since it's the circuit breaker period in our semi-lockdown in Singapore. In terms of poetry, I'm just rereading a lot of you know, Australian poets like Jenifer Harrison, Martin Harrison, not related. I'm reading a lot of poets. Yeah, a lot of Australian poetry. It's what's fascinating me right now. I'm reading a lot of older works by one of my favorite poets, Linda Paston. If you must know, Linda Paston is a poet from Maryland in the States, and she is basically one of the main reasons why I became a poet in the first place.
Wow.
Because there's something about her that is just, you know, she wouldn't raise any flags now, you know, because she's white, she's an old woman, she talks about nature, she talks about motherhood. It's all very old-fashioned themes, but there's something still quite timeless, even in a time where everything is so politicized. And so when I read her, it's just so refreshing to read something that's like, you know, pre all of this drama, you know, all of this drama. And Linda Paston talks a lot about everyday experiences, about being a mother, using very sparse language. And it is like listening to a favorite auntie on a patio with a glass of iced lemon tea, and just listening to her talk about, you know, her life, and talking about the war, talking about that tree, talking about that flower. It is very rejuvenating for me, because sometimes I myself, as a queer poet in Singapore, I get very tired of the politics of it. It's because there's more to life than having a political position and defending it with your life and fighting other people on their position. You know, there are more things to what life actually is. There are more intangible, mysterious things. And I would like poetry to return to it a little bit more without being seen as like not politically correct. Because we live in a time that is too politically correct now, and I really find it very problematic. Poetry should return us to more mysterious and intangible things, while being political if you want to, you know. So that's the challenge for a poet. If you can do both, you know, return to the more classic, timeless themes about nature, about what life is, while still being your, you know, marginalized self, you know. Yeah.
For our attendees, how do you spell her name so they can look her up if they want to?
I can
Linda
just write
Paston?
it here. Linda Paston, yeah.
Yes.
I can just write it here.
And while you're typing that out, I see that do you see a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen? I see that there are 2 questions in here for you. And if you don't see it, I can read it out for you.
I see, yeah. Okay, first question is, what advice do you have for young poets who are writing their first collection? Wow. That's always a loaded question because my answer changes every year.
Depending on the season and the feeling. And
yeah, correct. That's what's so wonderful. I mean, that's what's so wonderful about poetry. I feel there's a certain openness to how we write it and how we read it that never goes away, no matter how politicized the climate is. So I mean, if I were to get very technical about it, the advice I would normally give for a lot of participants in my workshops would be, make sure that you're coherent and make sure that you're logical from start to finish. I always use the metaphor of being an editor in a film. Continuity editing is very, very important. So if you're using certain kinds of images or metaphors and you're very obsessed about them, return to a state of hyper-consciousness about what those metaphors are that you're using. Because a lot of younger poets, they use images and analogies that they never think that they are using it all the time. And I always remind them that, you know, you keep drawing on this color or that image or this object or that tree. It's like, what is it about it that's obsessing you, and how is it connected to the themes of like relationships that you're dealing with in your work? So just being very conscious of that kind of connections. And if you're going to use a certain kind of metaphor or trope quite regularly, do it consistently and develop it as you write the collection. So the metaphor can evolve along with what you're saying in each poem. So that's, yeah. So I mean, my more simple answer would be just be very conscious of the kind of things that you're doing inside the collection.
That's great technical advice. Really awesome.
And next one is by Shou Jie Ing. Thanks for that. I want to return to the sense of surprise that you respond to as a reader, and maybe back away from the politics of reading. How does surprise and time enter into dialogue with each other? I was struck by the feeling of time in the poem you read and wondered if, as a reader, surprise grows, recedes, washes away, and returns. Well, that's like a poem in itself, yeah? Thank you for that. I think, to me, I think when I first started writing, this whole element of surprise was very, very, very important to me. I think I belong to a clique of friends that we were always trying to outdo each other when we first started writing. The last line, we were always trying to compete who could be the most surprising in the last line. But it was a very useful skill to develop over time, because the poem, whether we like it or not, it's something that needs to, I hate to use this word, but it's very early in the morning, so I can't think of another word. But the poem needs to entertain the reader in some way. It needs to have it's like a movie too. It's like the movie needs to have a twist. It needs to have an element of surprise. A lot of movies that I watch on Netflix now don't have any twist at all. They bore me to death. But a poem needs to have a twist. A poem needs to have an element of surprise in which you can tell that when the poet is writing the poem, and when the poet is writing the poem in the context of time, and in the time of writing that poem, right, it is as if the writing of it teaches the poet something new in the process of writing, and the poet surprises herself or himself. And if that surprise, the element of surprise can be recorded in the poem, that poem is usually very extremely memorable because you are on this trip with the poet
Yes.
in the process of going through the development of the metaphor and stuff like that. So it is this sense of like, I don't know, freshness, wonder that happens when reading the poem that has to come through. Yeah, that's what I really always look for, and that what surprises and entertains me when I read a book. It cannot be, when I think as a reader or as an intelligent reader, you will always know when a book is becoming too formulaic, or like the poet is resting on the laurels of like, I can always come up with this metaphor. I can always do this. I can always say this in a very nicely clever way. It's not interesting. Yeah. I don't know if that answered this question in any way. But yeah, I think surprise and time is interconnected in that way. It's, you have to convey that sense of like, like the poet's sense of surprising their own selves in the process of writing as the poem is being presented. Yeah.
Love it. That's also another piece of great advice, I think. I wanted to quickly mention before we go into these other questions that,
Yeah.
if this is a 30-minute event, so if you have to leave, thank you so much for joining us. But if you want to stay, please do, because I'm sure Cyril has so generously, offered to stay and answer the rest of these questions. So go ahead, Cyril.
Okay, thank you. Carissa, hi Carissa, I know you. Earlier you mentioned something about how poems convey a message or even simply an experience from your experience. How does this come through when reading the entire manuscript as a whole? There's more than the sum of its parts. And how might that stand out for you? There are two parts to this. The reader's experience and the writer's experience of this, they're two very different things. That's one thing that you need to be very careful of. There's an element of faith when you're putting together the components of a manuscript. So the only way you can hope for the manuscript to become more than the sum of its parts is when the writing of it, you follow certain set kind of like rules. To me then, well, I won't like to use the word rules, but rules is a very useful way of looking at it. I think I said this before, coherence. The metaphors that ideas or the analogies or the tropes must make sense from beginning to end, and there must be a sense of development. And once that sense of development happens, the poet in the writing or the developing of all these ideas will end up surprising themselves in the way the poems flow into each other, and how they coalesce into a manuscript. That's something that you have to transform yourself from becoming a writer to becoming a reader, and then reread your whole manuscript and go like, oh, I did this unintentionally, and that is surprising. Now, how do I control that? How do I manipulate or like reduce certain elements of this or expand elements of that? So, the role of the writer and the reader are two very, very separate things. But as a writer, you yourself have to be a little bit of a bipolar person. You have to be the writer, but also the reader of your own work. I go like, oh, wow, I didn't expect that my writing of this, which was very thought through in the beginning, to have this effect at the end. Now that the book has this effect at the end, how do I manipulate the effect even more? So you have to have two brains, basically. Don't just be the writer going like, I've written this, I'm done. No, you have to be the reader as well. And then you manipulate that. Yeah.
Love it. That's great.
The second part to that is how much more localized references on more universal themes or experience would be best on paper. Well, don't do this artificially. Don't just put in localized references just for the sake of it. I think that's my only simple answer to that. Because the moment you do that, it's not authentic. It becomes very artificial, and it's very obviously artificial, at least to someone like me. So if it happens organically, like if the localized reference happens in the context of a memory that you're trying to recall, then let it happen. But don't do it too consciously. Yeah, so that's my answer to that. Universal themes or experiences. Don't worry about that. That's like putting the cart before the horse. It's the same with like localized references or universal themes and stuff like that. That's, like I said, the writer must divide the brain between being a writer and a reader, right? Be the writer first. Then as a reader, you inspect the writing and go like, are there a lot of localized references? is it universalized enough? And also be very conscious of the fact that universality is an effect. There is no real absolute universality. You are seducing the reader into thinking that there is such a thing, to invite the reader to be moved by what you're writing about. But the paradox of universality is that there isn't one. It's a sense of openness there. The moment you try to be too obviously universal, you tend to be didactic. So that has to be something to be conscious about. Okay, the next one would be anonymous attendee. Sounds like Jiang. What do you think of prose poems? What are they good for? Don't they give up too much? For example, line breaks. Not really. Poetry for me is about insight. So if insight told in the most concise way, and prose poems can achieve that without line breaks. Some prose poems are just a single line. Some prose poems are just 2 or 3 lines, and they can sum up a lot more than, say, a whole short story. So yeah, as long as the prose poem possesses that element of surprising insight, a great metaphor, a very scenic, very cinematic image, that's as effective as any poem. Line breaks do not always, a poem with line breaks do not always achieve the same result as well. Sometimes you need to ramble a little bit. Sometimes you need to gush. Sometimes you need to do something that expresses a lot of passion and overflowing emotions. And prose poems are great for that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Next one is by Alta Lynn Price. Thanks for this event. Do you read poetry in translation from any given language? And if you do, can you name a favorite poet, volume translator? Thank you. I think in my earlier stage of my writing, I used to read a lot of Stephen Mitchell's translations of like Rilke. I mean, Rilke can get a little bit tiring after a while. I read a lot of poets in translation, especially Russian poets at the beginning, like Osip Mandelstam, and Anna Akhmatova, all of these poets. Stephen Mitchell wrote a very, very, I can't remember the title of the book now. It's a book of poems about Taoism. I think the spirit of Taoism. I can't remember what the book is, but Stephen Mitchell is one of my favorite translators of anything. John Ashbery's translation of Rambo is also pretty brilliant. It's Rambo in connection with the previous question, writes a lot of prose poems, very abstract, expressionistic, very cinematic, very mythical kind of prose poems. And John Ashbery captured the spirit of that expressionism really well. So that's one of my favorite. So read anything by Rambo translated by Ashbery. Okay, the next question is by Chris again. I meant how might more.
I think she was talking about her previous question.
Oh, okay. How
about
might,
localized references.
Okay, how might, okay. How might, I don't get it, sorry. How might more be best for people?
Maybe her next question would be...
Okay. Sorry about
and also
that.
After that, you have another question in the chat, which I will, if you can't, yeah.
Okay. Because I'm wondering from a technical standpoint that if I'm naturally doing it, but it might not be understood by readers, especially from an international audience. Oh, don't care about that. Please don't care about that. The whole idea of an international audience is a real delusion. It's like, what is an international audience? What does that even mean? It's like, I'm a poet from a small island called Singapore, and I consider myself pretty international as an audience because I read all kinds of poets from all over the world. But also there are poets there are readers in the States and UK, and they will never read anything from Asia, and they will not understand anything. And it's like, are those the readers that you're hoping to appeal to? And if a reader is sensitive enough, they would fixate not so much on the details so much, like the localized references, and they would fixate more on what you're trying to say about those references, the feelings around it, the kind of psychological insights and the kind of like political statements that you make will make sense regardless of what the context is. So you really shouldn't be too bothered about this. I really feel that the moment, it's a very Singaporean question as well, it's like this whole idea of a global audience or international audience is like, no, don't think about it. Think about the kind of poetry that you would want to read and appeal to the kind of reader that you also are. That is the first call of action as a reader. Yeah, and a writer. Yes.
Yes. There's a question for you in the chat.
Dana Lam, hello. Do you start with an insight or do you come to it during the writing of a piece? How do you start? Okay, let me deal with that first. It's both. Usually do start with an insight. I'm a very particular, I mean, it's probably, I'm not the only one, but as a poet or as an artistic person, I don't think in words first. I never do. I'm usually haunted by image or a scene or a feeling or mixture of all these things or a sound or a series of sounds. And then poetry becomes an exercise in trying to translate this abstract messiness inside my head to paper and going like, does this make sense to anyone else other than me, or is it just a weird dream? So the insight usually comes first. And then there's also another kind of secondary insight that comes through with language. So when you're translating this abstract thing inside your head on the page, the insight comes through when the language itself becomes your own teacher. The language will teach you something new about what you're trying to say and like gives you new like insights into like the way you're phrasing certain things, the way you're trying to capture meaning, and creates more meanings through the process of writing. And that for me is the joy of writing most of all, because it is not like writing a tweet or a Facebook posting, right? Creative writing is in itself a great teacher. It like shines a light back at you and like teaches you something new about your own memories, about your own personal truths. That is not just a simple regurgitation. How do I start? I just start by trying. By trying to translate the messiness in here. That's how I start. So the other question is, do you start with insight?
It's the same question, I think.
Okay.
Well, I'm guessing no one else has any more questions. I don't see any others in the Q&A or in the chat.
One new message here. Oh, thank you, Dana.
Dana. So, I mean, if that's it, it's 9:44. I guess we can go ahead and close this. And yes, let me remind you again about the details of the prize, which, as you know, Cyril will be judging. The deadline to receive your manuscript, your poetry book manuscript, is May 15th. So please put that in your calendar. Think about everything Cyril has said, ruminate on it. How can you? No, don't. You should write whatever feels true to you. Don't try to appeal, especially to Cyril, as he said, right? He takes everything according. I take
everything, and I love everything. I'm a free love kind of guy when it comes to poetry. I love all kinds of poetry. So
you can find more information and guidelines on how to submit at our website. I'm going to post it in the chat again, so you have it right here. Oh, and I see actually someone else had a technical question, and you can maybe answer that after I sort of give my little closing spiel. So don't forget, May 15, that's the deadline. And finally, I also wanted to let you guys know that we are having a virtual book launch for Play for Time by Filipino-Canadian author Paula Mendoza. She was the winner of our last year Gaudy Boy Poetry Book Prize. So if you want to get a sense of, you want to be on the other side of it and see the person who won the prize and is actually about to publish.
Incredible. She's really incredible.
That's so cool. Did you know about her from before?
No, I've been reading a lot of poems that have been coming through online. It's like, wow, every poem is just, okay, it's just a very, very unique voice. I mean, that's.
Well, Cyril, I hope we'll see you there. We are having the virtual event May 9th, so that's next Saturday. Unfortunately, it's a little early for Singapore. It's going to be 7:30 p.m. EST on Saturday, so I think that will mean 7:30 a.m. Sunday Singapore time. But we'll have a virtual potluck. We also have an open mic, and then Paula will read twice. So we'd love to see you there. And
Also,
Those are,
Kim, I think that
yes.
question is from Carissa. It's
Yes, go ahead
regarding
and
the
go
cover
ahead and
letter,
answer.
actually. So that's something that
Oh,
we
oh,
might answer. Yeah.
oh, okay, yes. So, Carissa, if you can just go to the website that I posted, and all the information you need should be there.
Hmm. Okay.
Other than that, Carissa, you can feel free to email us, and we can give you more information. If you can't find everything you're looking for.
Carissa just
Okay.
pasted.
Carissa, you can email G.
Yeah, email. Yeah,
Cover
just
letter.
email G at that email that you just pasted there. Yeah, I'm sure he'll help you there.
Yes, yes.
Right, G, are you there?
Okay, thank you so much, Cyril, and thank
Thank
you
you.
everyone who has joined us. Oh, Cyril, what's the title of the poem you read again? Hotel?
Hotel.
Okay, great.
Yeah, you can find it online. Just Google it. Yeah,
It's
hotel.
not published in any upcoming, in
It's
any
no, no.
previous.
It's published in my 2016 collection,
Oh,
The Lovers Inventory. Yeah.
okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I guess we should just go ahead and end the meeting. Thank you
Okay.
again, Cyril.
Thank you so much. Bye
Of
bye.
course. Thank you, everyone. Bye.